Greetings, I'm Keith Klein, the host of the VentureFizz Podcast, where I interview the most fascinating people in the tech scene. This is episode 318, and today's guest is Henrik Werdelin, entrepreneur and author. Incubators are not a new thing, but some are certainly more successful than others. Take Prehype, a venture development firm in New York City, where Henrik is a founding partner. It has holdings in major success stories like BarkBox and Ro, plus over a dozen other venture capital-backed startups. As a co-founder of BarkBox, he was part of the team that built one of the most successful subscription commerce companies with a focus on making dogs and their owners happy. The company went public in 2021 and has launched several successful businesses internally on top of the core business like Bark Food, Bark Bright, and more. Henrik's latest project coming out of Prehype is Audos, an AI co-pilot for entrepreneurs, which is committed to making entrepreneurship accessible to all. With a focus on customer-centric strategies and innovative problem solving, Audos empowers people to just get going. In this episode of our podcast, we cover lots of great topics, like a discussion around how greatness can't be planned, the details about Henrik's background, including his experience at MTV and how he ended up in the startup world, how Prehype operates, the story of BarkBox in terms of the full lifecycle of the company, including the day that BarkBox went public, all the details about Audos and how it will be helpful for entrepreneurs, Henrik's 8+1 framework, which allows him to be a bit more purposeful with what he spends his time on and live a more rich and meaningful life, and so much more. Okay, quick side note. This week's episode is sponsored by MarketMuse, a content intelligence platform that sets the standard for content quality. Their AI-powered software enables companies to create predictably better content at scale that increases traffic and engagement, improves productivity, and drives revenue. Get more out of your content with packages starting at $0 a month, that's free. Plus, you can get 20% off the MarketMuse standard plan by using our code FIZZ20, that's FIZZ20 at checkout. Go to marketmuse.com to get started. All right, without further ado, here's my interview with Henrik. Henrik, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to talk to you because we're going to talk about a lot of things that you've accomplished throughout your career. And one of the most successful subscription commerce companies that has ever existed, BarkBox. So there's a lot to talk about. You're doing a new startup. But before we get into all that, I did want to talk about a recent post that I noticed that you had out there of why greatness can't be planned. And it was like this alternative approach for entrepreneurs and researchers on just kind of like this open-endedness that you got to have this different mind shift as it relates to being great. So what does that mean?
Well, I stumbled over this book relatively recently, even though it's kind of a book that's been out for a bit, about from this professor who's a professor in AI. He's made a company, sold it to Uber, and became their head of their AI labs. And before that, I have told this story that I'll tell you and then kind of like lead into why greatness can't be planned. And so everybody's always asked me about like what goals I have. And I've always been a little bit kind of weirded out by how non-natural that question kind of came to me, because a lot of successful people I've read about or I've seen always talk about like you need to have a plan or think about where you want to be in 5 years. And one time I lived in New York for a long time, and there's a ping pong kind of club called Fat Cats, where all the college kids goes and drink beers because it's $1 for a beer. And in the evening, when the club kind of slows down, all the jazz musicians kind of show up. It's kind of the place where they hang out, and they start to play. And I noticed that the band, kind of the orchestra leader, kind of see these people as they kind of just come up, and he points at them, and they kind of go in the back, and they kind of start to jam. And then sometimes he points at them, and they go to the lead microphone, and they start to play. And then you can just hear the whole orchestra go like, oh, that's pretty cool. And they kind of change their tune a little bit. And so I've always been thinking that the way that I think about entrepreneurship is more like a jazz musician than a pop musician. Like I've never understood kind of like the beginning, middle, of end, because it's every time I tried to say, I want to build a very big company, it never really worked out for me. But when I've kind of started with first principle, like I want to build some cool shit with some people I like, then that had like led me the good places. And so I've always had this kind of super weird story that I just told as my reference for like this way that I'm thinking about being successful in entrepreneurship until I read this book. And so this book is basically an argument for how we get to artificial general intelligence. And so the way that he articulates, and the reason why he kind of got into these experiments that he writes about in the book, was because he wanted to try to find a way where we could kind of like do a leap step in artificial intelligence. And what he has discovered is that he feels, as AI researchers, they do these rule-based systems. Like they basically tell the AI engine where to go. And his thesis is that you need to not do that. You need to let it discover what he referred to as interestingness, and then basically have it kind of follow that. And so the post I wrote was basically totally hijacking that concept for entrepreneurship and saying, what if we, instead of always talked about what we wanted to achieve, but instead kind of like used where we was really inspired, where we got a lot of energy, and we just followed that and placed those as stepping stones in front of us. And that might lead us to a place that was completely different than we'd imagined, but it could become a place of greatness. And so, I mean, like, it's super philosophical, and I'm sure a lot of people go like, say what? But for me, it was just a very inspirational way of thinking about building companies, rather than I want to build a unicorn, I want to build something for 1 billion customers or whatever it is. But instead saying, I want to just follow where I find things or people or customers that are just inherent, very interesting to me. And if I do that, the skull will take care of itself.
I think that's so true. It's definitely a philosophy that I follow. It's got to be authentic. And I've probably said this a bunch of times on the podcast when I'm talking to like a venture capitalist, and it's like, B school students that sit around a conference room thinking of what business are we going to disrupt? And I can only imagine with AI right now that they're thinking like, what are we going to do with AI? What business? And like, there's so many possibilities, instead of it being authentic, right? Of something that they're really interested and passionate about. And it's something that came out organically versus forced. So
Exactly
totally
right. And I
agree.
think you're right. Like, I mean, and part of the things that we've done now with the new thing that we've developed called Audos is kind of based on that core thesis of what we call customer founder fit, or relationship capital, which is when you're building a new company, instead of going your classic kind of MBA way of saying, where is there a big market, or where is there kind of like new technology forming? What we do instead is we say, where are there customers you would like to serve for a long time? Like, where can you find passion and kind of like empathy with the people that you're going to be providing a product? And then, instead of looking for ideas, look for problems. So just identify a problem, real meaningful, hairy problem that they have. And then think of your products and services as basically thesis statements to solve those problems. And so we've been writing a bunch of white papers about that. And part of the models that we now created, which is Audos, which is this copilot for starting companies, is based on that core philosophy. Don't start with an idea, don't start with a technology, but start with an affinity group and a problem that you like to solve for them.
Very cool. Yeah, I'm excited to learn more about the new project you're working on. So, well, let's rewind the clock. So, where did you grow up? What were you like as a child?
I mean, like, I grew up in Copenhagen. I grew up with my mom. My parents got divorced when I was about 8, and my mom is a very amazing, very kind of like I would say eccentric person who doesn't really feel that there's any limits for anything she could do. And when I grew up, she worked at the National Library, and the woman that ran the library, kind of like back in the 80s, told my mom, whatever you do, make sure your kid kind of knows about computers. And so my mom spent most of the money she had basically buying me a computer. And so while everybody else got to play soccer outside, she was like, no, 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 you have to play with the computer. And so I was pretty nerdy early on, because I had this computer that I got exposed to, and then in the early 90s, I got exposed to the early parts of the internet, back when it was FidoNet and Gopher and Veronica, and like early internet days, and really kind of just got infected by the bug of like using it as a tool. And so I was always the one who started. I started the school magazine. I started the school radio. I did all, like I was always the one who was more excited about what he could build around school than necessarily doing good in class, but always based on technology.
Well, that I guess is a good segue. Like, so, you studied social and political science, so you could talk, like you could tell like your personality, it fits well with what you were studying, as well as journalism too.
Yeah, I thought at the time I wanted to be a CNN correspondent. That was kind of like my dream. And so I had practiced many times saying, "This is Henrik Werdelin reporting live, CNN." And so I did my undergrad in political and social science, and then my master's in journalism, and ended up, kind of working for the BBC doing radio documentaries. And I think actually, like, maybe just to tie that back to kind of like the story told earlier, one of the reasons I got the job was because at the time, and I'm dating myself, but the shows that we did at university, we did on tape, like old physical tape that we cut with a razor and kind of like sticky tape together. Except me, who had a very early computer, and so while the people I studied with handed in assignments, which were like big tapes, I basically came with a compact disc that was been editing kind of like on a 12-track kind of system. And so I'm not sure I was as good a storyteller as the people I studied with, but my productions were pretty slick. And so I got a job at the BBC after my first exam. The examiner at the exam was from the BBC, and he offered me a job. And then I kind of like got into journalism that way.
And then you ended up working at MTV, right? So um, I'm in the tech industry. I love what I do. But if there was a career path that would have been the alternative version of me, it would have been working for MTV. I watched way too much MTV as a kid, like an obscene amount. I just love music, and his videos were new back. Like I was, growing up when MTV was actually showing videos and it was new. So I was like, oh, so envious of what you were doing.
I mean, like I'm glad you remember MTV. I feel like sometimes when I tell people about it now, they're like, "MT what?" And you're like, "It was a big thing at the time." Um, I mean, like, there's a funny story about it. I at BBC, I did a radio documentary about Europop music, which was a specific kind of type of music that was big at the time. You might, have heard like the Barbie Girl song, like that Aqua made and stuff like that. And so I was doing a radio show on that, and I interviewed one of the VJs, and he asked, and I kind of like dropped that I wouldn't mind doing some television at one point. And so he said, well, he called me a few weeks later and said, "Hey, you want an internship? We have an intern that's off for like 3 or 4 weeks. You can come in and get some experience." And I was like, "That's great." And while I was there, I was writing my final thesis, and I didn't have a computer at home. So the boss kind of like noticed that I was sitting at the office until quite late and kind of struck up a conversation, and heard that I knew a lot about the internet. And so he asked if I could think of a show that was related to the internet. And this is like late 90s. Um, so came up with a show. I pitched it around the building a few times, and everybody thought it was kind of like a stupid idea. And so I got a little bit stubborn and ended up breaking into the studios at 2 in the morning and doing a live show, which were this interactive show that I dreamed up. And then the next morning, of course, thought I would get fired or sued or something worse. And so I was a little bit anxious, but MTV was a pretty rock and roll place at the time. And so instead of getting sued, I ended up getting promoted. And so I got to run product development for MTV International for quite many years, based on the stunt.
Yeah, but the stunt from researching your background before this conversation, it was actually you were a pioneer of user-generated content, right? Like,
Yeah, I mean, like, yeah, at the time it wasn't that considered normal, but I thought it would be incredibly cool to show user stuff on air. And so yeah, I mean, like a lot of the stuff what we did we also kind of came up with the first, and it wasn't as big as in the US as in the rest of the world, but we also came up with the first shows where you could text kind of like the TV screen, um, and then ruled that, ran that on many channels. And so I think it was just using technology in a playful manner, and maybe back to the earlier point of, it was just good fun. And so I think, playing with it allowed us to come up with stuff that then also resonated with the audience.
So what'd you do next?
I met some friends, talked to some friends who had started Skype, and they were keen to do something in the video space. And so they lured me to join kind of like a project that was kind of ill-defined at the time. And so they raised a bunch of money, and basically we tried to create a virtual cable operator. And so I did that for 3 or 4 years, and it didn't end up being a big exit, but it did allow me to really learn how do you build a venture-backed company. And it introduced me to a lot of people, and I learned endless amount of stuff from them and from that experience. And so I went a little bit to a venture fund called Index Ventures as an entrepreneur in residence, and then after that I moved to New York, where I ran into a group of guys, like 4 or 5 guys who had started a company called Hot Potato, and I got to help them on the product side, building this product. And we were lucky enough to get picked up by Facebook relatively fast.
Which I remember Hot Potato, because it was a very quick exit. I remember the investors, it was a crazy list of investors. I looked it up again. Yeah, because I remembered First Round Capital was probably the one that, just connected the dots for me. But it was a crazy list of investors for that company.
Yeah, I mean, Justin Shaver, who was the founder, is this incredible person who had been at MLB and before, and done a lot of interesting work there. And so I guess in many ways we were trying to build like a system for how do you check into activities. So how do you create a shared space if you're watching a football match or what have you. What it allowed me to do was it gave me a bit of space to figure out what I wanted to do next. And what I learned was that if you're like somebody who had had a few times in the ringer of entrepreneurship, and you didn't want to go back to venture, and you didn't want to go to a corporation, and you didn't want to sit by yourself in the coffee shop, there weren't really any halfway houses for kind of second-time founders. And so I spent a little bit of the money that I made renting out a big warehouse in Chinatown, and basically, told everybody I met who I thought was interesting people that they were very welcome to come and hang out. And in that space, we created a bunch of companies that ended up becoming pretty successful. And so anything from Bark, of course, that we talked about, but we helped create Ro, which is now a very big mental health company, and Managed by Q, we sold to WeWork and Co, and for them, and a lot of other companies that kind of ended up becoming real meaningful companies. And so
And this is pre-hype.
this is pre-hype, yeah.
So this
And so,
is like a venture studio or like an incubator. Like, how would you classify it?
you know what? I think we look like a studio from the outside, but for the inside, we always were more halfway house. So we were more kind of like a kind of like a group of like-minded, quirky people that didn't really know what we wanted to do, and everybody was asking what we were working on. And so if we could create a little bit of a polished website and have one email, we could work on a lot of different things and nobody would bother us. I'll give you because we started pretty philosophical. I was still in the philosophical lane. I have always been very inspired by places like Abbey Road Studios or Motown, or some of those physical places that have created these incredible kind of like pieces of music. And of course, like we think of the Beatles, and we think of, like all the massive stars that's gone through these studios. But I would argue that there was like some magic happening in those physical rooms where there were some studio musicians, there were some engineers, there was kind of like a culture, there was like a methodology of how you were doing stuff. And all this thing came together around these very talented people to create something that was purely magical. And so I always wanted to create that for building companies. And prehype, we're lucky that we were just starting in 2010, 11, when the internet kind of industry in New York really started to pop. And then we were very fortunate that we managed to create a space where people could come and hang for a while. And there was no real pressure, and there was no real model, and there was no real kind of way that people were expect to behave. And out of that, kind of like almost like art collective, came kind of a lot of these things. Now, we're very structured in how we think about stuff. We're very methodical in how all this stuff, and we were lucky enough that we had a big corporate incubation arm of our business that created like the cash flow for a lot of these people to kind of like work a little bit for a big company and then kind of spend the next 3 weeks working on their own stuff. And so for me, at least, it was a very magical place that created a lot of the successes, but not in a very kind of predictable, methodical way. And so I always feel a little bit, I always feel it's a little bit tough to figure out how to label it, because we're not a classic studio, we're not a classic incubator, we're a little bit of a weird hodgepodge of all of them.
Well, let's talk about BarkBox. So, how did you go about meeting your other co-founders, Matt and Carly? How did the idea come to fruition? What's the background story?
I mean, like, the funny background story is the first time I meet Matt, we are at a conference on a boat. And this is, it's kind of like, it's called the Summit Series, and it's kind of a bunch of founders that kind of like meet up. But it was on this boat. And he, and if you pick the cheapest ticket you can get, you were kind of auto paired with somebody you didn't know in this cabin on this cruise ship. The whole conference was on a cruise ship. And so I check in first into the cabin, and it's like this, nice little cabin on a cruise ship. And they have like a heart-shaped bed that obviously have been pushed apart because you're kind of paired with a random person. I think it would be hilarious to push them back together. So I remake the bed as a heart-shaped bed. And then I go up and have a few drinks. And so I go to come back to bed quite late. Matt, who I don't know at the time, has already checked in and gone to bed. And so I'm literally kind of like sneaking under the duvet with this stranger that I've never met before. And so the first time I ever talked to my co-founder, Matt, we were waking up on a heart-shaped bed on a cruise ship, kind of just shaking hands randomly over the blanket. But then we were sitting and talking and figuring out that we shared a lot of the same values and a lot of the same experiences in building companies. He had built Meetup before, which obviously is a big company. And yeah, and then we were just brainstorming different things. Matt had a dog called Hugo that was kind of his child, and we were kind of blown away by how little cool stuff there was. And so the idea of kind of a Birchbox for dogs kind of like materialized, and he was kind of exploring a lot of different things, and I wanted him to come and hang in the collective. And so I built the first version of BarkBox kind of as a WordPress template, just to kind of, I guess, impress him a little bit. And then we started to show it to people, and they started to say, "Oh, that sounds cool. I'd like that for my dog. Just let me know when I can sign up." And we were like, "Well, we have Square on our phones, so you can just give me the money right away, and we'll kind of like." So I think we ended up having 70 customers of this yet to be invented product before we had anything else. And so Matt and I at the time didn't think it would be a very big business. So our evil plan was to find a younger third co-founder that could kind of do a lot of the work. Enter Carly, who is this incredible person that can make everything happen. And so we kind of blinked twice, and before we knew it, Carly had gotten hold of boxes and products, and we were being put to work packing these things. She had started Uber in New York before, so it was already like achieved. And so, yeah, and it kind of like just materialized from that. And then the whole thing just started to move very fast. And then obviously 10 years down the road or 12 years down the road, you're a public company, and suddenly you're a big company now.
Well, I think a good lesson learned right there is you built like an MVP, I guess, for lack of a better term. It was a very lean approach to building a company initially. You had revenue coming in. It was bootstrapped for a stretch, right? Like it's not like you were, hey, we got this idea, let's go pitch the VCs, raise some capital, and see if we've got product market fit. You had already justified that, started generating revenue, already delivering product.
Absolutely. I mean, like Matt and I, one of the things we bonded on was like our dream about building a company that would never raise capital. And so we were very focused on, like, sounds like a novel idea, make a business that makes money. And so yeah, I think our whole ethos and the core culture were always, how do you make frugal so you can basically not run out of money, so you can design your own destiny. Now, we then ended up meeting RE, who also was an investor in Hot Potato, and Mike Hirschland from Resolute Ventures, and they were kind enough to put a bit of money in, and have been great partners ever since.
Okay, but how did you go about scaling, right? So customer acquisition is, a challenge, and you kind of maybe hit some solid metrics, but to continue the expansion and growth over time is definitely tricky to the scale that your company hit.
Yeah, I mean, like, first, Matt is just incredibly good with online marketing, probably better than most people I've ever met. And so a lot of the credit is him. And one of our early hires was a guy called Rob Schatz, who then ended up be the co-founder of Ro, who ran our growth at the time. I think the second thing, which I guess people could maybe use, is that I've always been passionate about not defining your business as the product or the utility you provide, but kind of the problem you solve for the customers. And so we always saw ourselves as somebody who were trying to make dogs and their people happy, rather than see ourselves as a stuff in a box business. And so over the years, we created a media company and a treats business and a food business and various services businesses. And so our growth were always these kind of layers on top of the core business that we had. And that's continued to be our growth driver, where at one point you kind of run out of customers in the specific segment you are in, and then you kind of layer a new product on top of it that you can then sell to the customers that you've already attained.
Well, and the audience, the customer, dog owners are a unique breed, no pun intended. And I mean, because they're just so passionate, right? Like we have a Cavapoo at home, and the dog rules the house. Like everything is catered towards Stella. So it's a perfect vehicle for stickiness, viral social media content. And I was looking back at some BarkBox content, and it's obviously you need the creativity, but it's stuff that if you have that creativity and the vision, it is going to go far, and word of mouth is going to happen naturally.
Yeah, and I honestly think if now obviously reflecting back on it, I think a lot of the stuff I learned at MTV, I brought into the BarkBox world, where MTV was never about the utility of music. Like, you didn't see shows that was, how do you tune your guitar, or 5 ways to attend a concert. It was, how do you have rock and roll at heart? Like, what's the culture behind music? And I think we took that kind of playbook and basically did it in the dog world, where it was, how do you make dogs and their people happy, and how do you create experience design around that can really kind of create more moments where owners of dogs can make their dogs as happy as the dogs makes them. And so that's why we're very early on social. We were very early on content. and everything we do kind of like is seen through that lens.
And you talked about the other businesses that were built on top of it. So, you know, Bark Shop, which is like a Chewy competitor, right? Um, Bark Care, so that's more, you know, caring for your dog. I mean, there's so many Bark Eats, you know, feeding your. So there's so many things that I'm sure lots of ideas came to fruition for things that you could build on top of. So what were some of the failures of thinking about other businesses that this is going to be the home run? It didn't work out. Like some lessons learned.
Yeah, I mean, like we have, as you can tell, we have many. I mean, like I wrote a book about it called the Acorn Method, which is really the philosophical view that you should grow yourself as a forest, not as a very tall tree. And so that's the philosophy also applied. I'll give you a few. Like maybe I'll start with the more fun one. We created something called BarkShop Live, which were basically inspired by a day I was sitting in the office and I noticed that we have this big pile of dog toys in the office, and I would notice that, and it happened to be next to where I sat. And I noticed every morning all the office dogs would come in and they would kind of dive into this kind of big pile of toys, like Scrooge, like, you know, in his money tank. And they would always like seem to be going for something that the specific thing. It wasn't that they were just grabbing a toy, they were going for like a specific toy. And I was like, hey, wait a minute, like, you know, like we just assume that a toy is a toy, but like dogs have personalities, they have individual tastes, you know, like they have preferences. And so we created a shop called BarkShop Live, which were the first shop where dogs could do the shopping themselves. And we put RFIDs into tags in all the toys. We created these vests that the dogs could wear, and then we created a cafe where the owners could sit and chillax. And so basically, you would book a time, the dog will go in, it could run around, play with the toys, and then on your phone, as you're drinking a cup of coffee, you could see basically the toys that the dogs kind of played with. Now, interesting enough, what happened was that we would then present the result to the owners, and the owners would go and buy the toy that they liked the most, like completely ignoring kind of this thing. And so it didn't become like our own shop. It did inspire Target to call us up and saying, hey, we see that you are thinking differently about retail. Would you be our partner? And now we're distributing all Target stores and other retailers, but Target was kind of our launch partner and somebody that we're very excited about working with. And so I think one lesson is that while kind of like the original concept might have failed, the kind of adjacent kind of success would never have happened if we hadn't had that failure. And I think a lot of the time, successes are kind of like they're unpredictable and they're non-linear, but you kind of have to do all these different things. Otherwise, you'll never end up kind of figuring out what it is, the thing that you should have been doing for the first to start with.
All right, so eventually, you know, as you said, you scaled, right, and you grew, and uh, Bark went public via SPAC in 2021. So what was that like?
I mean, like, I thought honestly that it wouldn't be that big of a deal. You know, it was kind of like it was kind of like, you know, a way of financing the business. You raise capital that way. I, I thought that until I stood there ringing the bell. And I don't know, I'm not like necessarily very proud about it because obviously it's a super vain kind of moment. But as a founder, there's not that many times when you win. Like when you get acquired, kind of like just work continues the next day. When you fail, obviously it's very miserable and you lick the wounds for a long time. And as you kind of, and if you fundraise, you kind of know that the fundraise will probably happen a little bit ahead of time, and you never really celebrate the fundraise because like you don't really celebrate taking a mortgage on your house. But ringing the bell was kind of the only thing I've ever done in my entrepreneurial career where I kind of for a moment thought, you know what, this was pretty cool. Like we did something pretty remarkable here. I think it's like winning an Oscar, I'm sure, for a movie director. And so for a split second, the imposters kind of like demons left the body. I mean, I had practice looking cool on the
On the
pressing the
podium.
bell. And then I see the video and I look like a 6-year-old who just got a PlayStation. I mean, like my whole face have like my chins are getting cramps because I'm laughing so much. I'm just very happy. And so I mean, like there's obviously all the business side of it. But really as a founder, it was very profound. And it was as a person, it was just remarkable. And I honestly think I've attained some calmness on the other side of it, because we're not that many people who start a company and then take it public. And that was an incredible day for me and hopefully for the team, and something I'll remember forever.
Yeah, it should be recognized and celebrated because, to your point, you took something from an idea to a publicly traded company, and very few entrepreneurs get to have that full life cycle journey. So it is something that should be celebrated.
And even though like now, like obviously like a lot of other people, our share price have been, like really been depressed after, you can't really take that day away from you, right? Like you're the, and so, no, I appreciate you saying that, but yeah, it is a big moment, even though I guess as a business, it's just like it's another financing event, and probably if I hadn't been as immature, I would probably see it more like that. But I think the
I think that would have
insecure.
been really boring if you were just on that stand or podium and you're just like, financing event. And then like confetti's coming down. You're like, just another day. No.
The other day at work. I remember, I mean, like I sat the night before and I obviously was part of creating our logo, because I ran, a lot of the creative side of the house. And I remember sitting, there's like a little bench outside the New York Stock Exchange, and I just saw them roll out like this huge kind of like logo. I get
Yeah,
goosebumps just saying it. And I mean,
absolutely.
like, being from I felt like the kid from Copenhagen that kind of like had landed in America, and kind of like suddenly you were on the big stage, and it was a very profound moment.
All right, well, let's talk about your latest project. So what are you working on now?
Yeah, so I mean, like besides Bark and the activities prehype, my colleague at prehype, Nicholas, and I got access very early to OpenAI, like I think late 2019, 2020. And I think in many ways had the feeling that I had back in the late 90s when I saw the internet. I was like, this technology is incredible. And a lot of like the inventions and the developments and the leaps that we've seen with the internet, we're about to see again, probably just much faster. And so got very, very excited about it. And both in Bark, but also in Prehype, we were then thinking, well, how do we take some of the workflows and some of the insights we have, and how do we atomize it and codify it into something that could be useful for people? And so Audos became our attempt of trying to take almost 15 years of running a process that helped people start something from scratch and condense it into a AI-based copilot. And so what Audos is a system that allows somebody who would like to build something but don't know what it is yet to come in and basically raise their hand to an AI bot. And then the AI bot, or these autonomous agents, as it were, because obviously there's a big system behind, will then walk you through helping you identify what customer to serve, what problems they might have, how to reframe that problem so you can expand the problem set, how to ideate different ideas for it, how to build a website, how to make a pitch deck, how to make service, how to get customers in, and yada. So we've basically are trying to give people who would like to be entrepreneurial a Iron Man suit, to kind of become that entrepreneur that they are dreaming about becoming.
So what's a good example of like how this would work?
So, I mean, right now, and we tried a lot of different versions. The thing that's working for us right now is we run ads on Instagram. You say, it basically says, have you ever thought about selling something, but don't know what it is yet? Press here. And you basically are thrown into a DM with our bot. Audos, the bot. You can also go to audos.com and then kind of go in that way. And then it would very simply, it'll ask you, who would you like to serve? It could be somebody that you feel close to, or it could be yourself. And then let's say it was me. And then it might say, well, what is a problem you're trying to solve? And it could be kind of like a big, meaningful problem. I'd like to be a better dad and spend more time with my kids. But it could also be something very practical, like I get a lot of cold emails in my inbox, and they're not spam, so they don't get filtered, but they still kind of takes up my attention. So I'd like to get them filtered out. And then it will literally help you brainstorm around that idea and make it better. And then the bot will build you a pitch deck that is based on something we call a lean product plan, which is basically a seed investment proposal, because that's an incredibly good tool to articulate an idea you have and think through a lot of the components that you need to think through in order to build a business. So who's the customer? What's the pricing? What's the market sizing? What's your first 30, 60-day plan? All those different things. And the AI system will build that for you. And then if you have questions or changes or things you don't agree with, you can just have a conversation with the bot and it will kind of update the deck. So let's say you don't like the logo or the name or the tagline and all those different things. And so what we see now is just a whole swarm of people coming through. I mean, I read somewhere that 60% of Americans kind of have a business idea. They're basically just not ready to try to, live it out. And so what we hope to create is a system that, potentially next year can help 10,000 companies being built, maybe over 3 years, 1 million. So really increase the velocity and reduce the gap between people wanting to try to be an entrepreneur and then actually becoming one.
Well, I mean, this is going to be interesting just because with AI, like so much is being done. And I was reading about a company yesterday that raised capital, um, actually looking them up. So they, it's an AI generated website for businesses. And I'm like, okay, I'll try this. So I just went to the website and it's just like, what's your business idea, whatever. And I typed in like a quick little prompt and it spit out this fully functional website in like a second. And it wasn't bad. I mean, it wasn't as good as what, someone building it from scratch would be, but it wasn't bad, which I was just like, oh my God, this is so crazy where, I mean, this is obviously disrupting like Squarespace, right? So it's just, I mean, it had a description that you can edit, but the description, I'm like, that's pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, and I think we see that everywhere, right? I think the cool thing about AI is if you think of it as a tool for people who are generalists, who have passion for solving a problem. I mean, it's just a power tool that we've never seen it before. And so I do believe, and I hope that for, the entrepreneurial class, this will be something that can just accelerate how quickly we can build stuff and make it less stressful to run it.
So I found the company name. It's called Durable. So if you go to durable.co, that's the AI powered website creator. It's pretty cool. So I just want to leave that to tie up the loose end there. But so what's your plan with the new company? Like, what are the goals?
Yeah, I mean, no, I think we have quite big ambitions for it. I think we have always been fortunate enough that we've had a good roster of entrepreneurs and residents at Prehype that we've been able to help build, real meaningful companies. Now, the reality is that we always had to kind of, we were non-scalable, as in we were only so many people and there was only so many people we could have in our office and we could kind of help at the same time. What we hope to do now is by using the scale that AI allow us to do, then we will be able to help tens and hundreds and millions of people do the same thing. And instead of kind of having to, every time that somebody has a problem, throwing kind of like our network of experts at them, we can now, every time that we help one person, we can take that advice and feed it into our model and then use that obviously in a completely scalable way. So anybody from any place in the world will be able to get access to the type of expertise that normally was only reserved for the people who are in our organization. And
Very,
so
very cool.
it is a very real mission of, we think the world has a lot of problems to solve, and we think entrepreneurs are incredibly well suited to try to solve those problems. And more entrepreneurship is good for the world. And a lot of people that we meet are incredible people that we feel could be real talented, successful entrepreneurs. And therefore, we'd like to give them a bit of help to kind of get there.
All right. Well, one of the other things that I saw that you had written about is a system you have for managing lots of different things that you have going on, because you obviously are juggling a lot. So what are the details on your 8+1 system?
I was on a sabbatical and I started to write in these small notebooks. And every time I'd finish a notebook, I would, put it down and I would just remember, write down again whatever I could remember from the last notebook. And so kind of through 3 months, 4 months, like the best ideas would percolate like to this book. And the thing that you mentioned was basically something that I developed on that sabbatical, which were, how do I create a method for becoming the person that I'd like to be? And for me, that is not necessarily being a high achiever in everything. It is to be pretty good at a lot of stuff. And the 8 things that is meaningful in my life is, if we start with business, is making enough cash flow to make sure that I could pay for the food and the lights and keep my family happy. It's, how do I invest? So how do I create compounding interest over time? So, as I'm getting older, I don't have to put in as many hours. It's assist. How can I help people in courses? It's learn, which is about what is my output and how do I become better at outputting that with high quality at scale. It's health, which is basically how do I maintain a good, hardware and software. So how do my mind and my body make sure that it can stay the distance? It's family. How do I become a good dad and husband and son and things that I would like to be with my family? It's relationship. I'm a little bit, maybe it sounds a little bit kind of weird, but like, I think we become the people we surround ourselves with. And so I think with that, you should be ambitious with the people that you're with, not necessarily for wealth, but just for good qualities and principles and something, that you're aspiring to be of. And then the last one is ego or self-kindness, just making sure I maintain some time to eat that chocolate and go for that walk. And then the +1, so those are the 8 boxes. And the +1 is to be purposeful and mindful of actually looking at those 8 boxes once a week. And so what I do is I allocate time in my calendar. I go through the boxes. I look at where I think I am, either underperforming or where I could benefit from coming up with some methods that would yield a better output for the resource I allocate to it. I'll give you like a weird example. At the time, I was playing, I have 2 sons, and I was playing with one of my sons, and I noticed that we would play in his playroom, and I would honestly get a little bit bored of the game. And so I'd pick up my phone, and he would call me on it, and I would obviously be mortified and die inside when a 3-year-old tell you to put down the phone. I was like, okay, how do I solve that? And so I was like, in my next session, I was sitting and thinking this through, I would be, hey, okay, I need to come up with a different way where this doesn't happen. And I realized that I used to play ping pong with my dad when I was a kid, and I loved it. And so I bought one of those things you could put on your dining table to make it into a small ping pong table. And so the next kind of like time I was hanging with my son, we did that and had a great time. I didn't look at my phone because I was still playing ping pong. And it was just like and then obviously we can do that over and over again. And then I layer more and more of those ideas on top of that. And I try to do that in any of the boxes at all times. And so what I hope is over time to be increasingly a better version of myself in each of these boxes, and hopefully then live a rich and meaningful life in that way.
Well, you've written a book, The Acorn Method. It sounds like this system could be a book in itself. Maybe that's
You
like,
know what? I've been thinking about it, and I think I am drafting a few things into that effect.
all right. So I was looking at your LinkedIn feed because that's just another good way to kind of research somebody. And you created this post that had an AI generated avatar of yourself that was scary. Like people are going to watch this podcast and then look at this post on LinkedIn and be like, yeah, that is freakishly good avatar version of you. That's not real.
Well, I mean, like, I love playing with new technologies, and I spend a good few hours a day researching the latest in AI, and I feel it to be very difficult to keep up. And so, I mean, I'm just blown away by the velocity of what things going. And then obviously with that type of avatar, when you start to play with it, you then realize how powerful it is. But I think it's also in the playing that you start to come up with ideas of how you can make it useful for your life.
So what are 3 apps you can't live without?
I will say, I mean, I should bring my phone and see what's on the homepage, right? I would basically, based on this, I would say ChatGPT app, the plus version. I babble most like all my philosophical kind of thoughts into it, and I basically say, please give me a structured note version of this, and I basically get like my babbling weirdness back at me in a way that it sounds not too dumb. I like I like an app called Bloom. It's a cognitive behavioral therapy kind of meditation type app. And so it's basically, I find a good way of keeping yourself a little bit kind of anchored. Uh, and it gives you just some tools. So kind of like, how do you make sure your mind doesn't kind of run crazy? What else do I have here that people might know? Oh yeah, I travel a lot. So I have an app called Flighty. And it's basically, yeah, it takes the itinerary from your inbox, and it's just a really nice visual representation of where to go and what the gate is and how many hours there's left. So those would be the three recommendations.
All right, what do you like to do for fun outside of work?
I mean, I like to do a lot. I think, well, it's getting to be winter, so I think skiing is probably the thing that's top of mind. I love skiing. Probably a little bit more of the European skiing, which is more about drinking wine and eating cheese than the GoPros and vertical drops. But I do love being on the mountain.
Well, Henrik, thanks so much for taking the time to walk us through your background story, all the companies you've built, and what you're working on now, and obviously all the great advice.
Appreciate being on.